What were the main ideas of the scientific revolution?
Some of the key ideas and theories that came out of the scientific revolution were that Earth revolves around the Sun. Matter is composed of small particles. Everything that happens can be explained mechanically or mechanistically with the help of mathematics. General principles or natural laws must be supported by observable data, and, perhaps most important, that science itself is an exciting activity that will benefit mankind.
What did Ludwig Wittgenstein accomplish in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus?
Although the work is considered one of the greatest achievements in philosophy, it's really not clear. Wittgenstein's stated intention was to address the problems of philosophy that had preoccupied Gottlob Frege. 1848 to 1925, and Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, Arthur Schopenhauer. 1788 to 1860, was another influence on the work, although he said at the end of this work, "My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way: anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical." At the beginning of the book, Wittgenstein claims that his main purpose is ethical. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus consists of 7 sets of numbered propositions or statements, which are believed to be about the connection between language and the world. It seems to present an account of the essence of language as expressive of thought. Thought, according to Wittgenstein, is limited to what is factual, so that the propositions of language are representations of the world. The propositions of logic, on the other hand, convey no factual information. Logic consists of tautologies. Logic is very useful, but all of its conclusions are true by definition. Wittgenstein believed that a meaningful sentence must have a precise structure that is made up of simple, in Russell's language, atomic, sentences or simple names. Atomic sentences are pictures of states of affairs. Working backwards from this picture theory of meaning, it would follow that, given the ideal logical language, the world itself has a logical structure. Wittgenstein was to later abandon this view in favor of philosophical activity that consisted of descriptive analysis of ordinary language. But before he did that, the Tractatus had enormous influence on the new 20th century school of thought known as logical positivism.
What was the Frankfurt School?
The Frankfurt School was the intellectual activity associated with the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. The institute was made possible by a gift from Felix Weil. 1898 to 1975, in 1923, following the first Marxist week, which was very well received by intellectuals. The institute was, in addition, funded by Frankfurt University and, during the Nazi period, 1933 to 1944. Max Horkheimer, 1895 to 1973, and Theodore Adorno, 1903 to 1969, secured the support of Columbia University to set up its exiled version as the International Institute of Social Research in New York City. The institute in Frankfurt was reinstated after World War II ended in 1945. Walter Benjamin, 1892 to 1940. Herbert Marcuse, 1898 to 1979, and Erich Fromm, 1900-1980, were also among its first generation of members. Jürgen Habermas, 1923, remains its most famous contemporary member. Hannah Arendt, 1906 to 1975, had political interests that implied she had more in common with the Frankfurt School than any other movement. Despite striking out on her own as an American philosopher after leaving Germany. Although not part of the Frankfurt School because he was imprisoned by the Italian fascist government in 1926, the Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci, 1891 to 1937, deserves mention in this context.
How did the British Royal Society come about?
The British Royal Society grew out of the Invisible College. And the Invisible College was inspired by Francis Bacon's New Atlantis.
How was G. E. Moore a realist?
Moore was at times a naive realist and at other times a representative realist. All realists believe that there is a real, external world. Naive realists hold that we directly perceive objects in this world. Representative realists think that what we perceive are the effects of those objects on our organs of sense. Or, in other words, that what we perceive are not objects but sense data caused by real objects.
Who was Gotthold Lessing?
Gotthold Lessing, 1729 to 1781, represented the Philosophes in Germany, which was a difficult task, owing to the conservatism and strict censorship there. In Nathan the Wise, 1779, he argued for the toleration of Jews and for human equality across religions. In On the Education of the Human Race, 1780, he claimed that all religions are part of a progression of humanity to the point when it will turn away from religion and toward pure reason.
What are the distinctive methods of postmodern philosophy?
Building on the work of structuralists, particularly Ferdinand de Saussure, 1857 to 1913, and Jacques Lacan, 1901 to 1981. Most postmodern philosophers take social systems of language and symbols as their primary subject matter. More than that, they view the entire human world as existence within and through language. Their methods of analysis are variably hermeneutic, critical, and genealogical. More specifically, deconstructionism proceeds by identifying aporia, or contradictions in Western thought, that rested on theological principles insofar as they were ultimately inaccessible to consciousness. Typically, modern aporia required binary pairs, such as right and wrong, or being and non-being, each member of which was falsely defined in opposition to the other.
What were Rousseau's most influential ideas?
Rousseau proclaimed and argued for the natural goodness of man. It was society and custom that created human vice and evils in the world, he felt. For example, in the natural state, primitive man had a form of wholesome self-love, or amour de soi, which in society became amour propre, or pride and vanity about how he was regarded by others. In the natural condition, man is born free, but in society, the institution of private property, which Rousseau considered a form of theft, as well as other corrupt institutions, resulted in man being everywhere in chains. Rousseau posited a natural sympathy in human relations, which had been corrupted by greed, and a simple piety, which was distorted by organized religion. This vision of the goodness of man was set forth in Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. 1750, and in his novels. In Of the Social Contract, Principles of Political Right, 1762. Rousseau addressed the same questions treated by Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704, of how, given original freedom, a good government can be imagined to come about, and what such a government would be like. Rousseau postulated that individual rights are given up to the community in the founding contract. In return, the individual becomes a citizen whose rights are protected. But this is an active model of citizenship because the individual is required to agree to the general will at the same time that he or she acts in self-interest.
What is the British Association of Science?
The purpose of the British Association of Science is to promote sustainability and make science and technology accessible to the public. However, on the organization's website they credit David Brewster, who invented the kaleidoscope in 1815, as its principal founder, not William Whewell. The association now has about 3,000 members, is mainly concerned with the popularization of science, and sponsors a young scientist program that has about 12,000 members. Each year since 1932, the British Association of Science has held a Festival of Science, featuring hundreds of speakers. You can learn more about their current activities at http://www.the-ba.net/the-ba.
How did Johannes Kepler's career develop?
Kepler, 1571–1630, studied astronomy and was prepared to become a Lutheran minister. When he was appointed a mathematician at the University of Graz. At that time, mathematics included both astronomy and astrology. In 1596 he published the Mysterium Cosmographium, which was the first comprehensive work on astronomy that was based on the Copernican system. At the time, Graz was dominated by Catholics, and Kepler had to flee on religious grounds, because he was a Protestant. He went to Prague, where Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, the famous observational astronomer, had an observatory. Kepler composed a defense of Brahe's observations against Nicolaus Ursus, who had attacked them as mere hypotheses. Kepler also claimed that, in addition to merely selecting the Ptolemaic or Copernican system, independent physical explanations are necessary. Using Tycho's observational data, Kepler then began work on the orbit of Mars. After Tycho died, Kepler was given his position as imperial mathematician, and also complete access to all of Tycho's data. In 1609 Kepler published a new astronomy based on causes or a physics of the sky. Kepler then had to leave Prague for the same reasons he had fled Graz. After he went to Linz, his research included music, theology, and philosophy, in addition to mathematics, which included astronomy. In his 1612 Epitome Astronomiae Copernicanae he again emphasized the importance of causal explanation, as well as observational predictions, in studies of the movements of the planets. His 1618 Harmonia Mundi was the final expression of this thought. He said of this work, "It can wait a century for a reader, as God himself has waited 6,000 years for a witness." Kepler was not the last great astronomer to believe he had special information about God. Isaac Newton's, 1643–1727, work was to take the same high tone.
How does Plato define a just city in his Republic?
In the Republic, Plato's theory of forms reaches its full development as he presents a, to him, utopian way of life. In order to understand justice in the individual, he sets out to describe a just city, the individual writ large. The main political principle of justice is a kind of division of labor that is mirrored in the tripart division of the human being, or soul, into body, emotions, and spirit, and reason. For Plato, what we experience as the body belonged to the realm of mere appearance. Just as human beings are happiest when their reason rules, it is necessary that the ideal city be ruled by those in whom reason is most perfect, namely, philosopher kings and queens. Below the rulers are a guardian class of police and soldiers, who correspond to the spirited part of an individual soul, and at the bottom are the mechanics, servants and farmers, who are like the appetites, or an individual's physical body. To ensure that the rulers love and serve their city above all else, Plato suggests that the family be abolished. In his social structure, men and women do not have to base their lives on their biological reproductive roles. Private property is unnecessary, too, as are monogamous sexual relationships or traditional marriage. The smartest, healthiest, and altogether best boys and girls will be specially trained. Beginning with a simple diet, plain living conditions, and exercise in the open air. Because the poets lie and teach impiety, there will be no literature in the new curriculum. In young adulthood, the young rulers will be taught mathematics and philosophy. At the age of 35, they will be sent out into the world for 15 years. To serve the community as lower administrators, police, and soldiers. At the age of 50, they will be ready to rule, all the more so because it will be against their desire to devote the rest of their lives to study of the forms. Plato, like many since him, believed that those who do not wish to rule are the very ones who should rule.
Who were Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno?
Max Horkheimer, 1893 to 1973, and Theodor Adorno, 1903 to 1969. Were founding members of the Frankfurt School, and they were its leaders in exile. Horkheimer was a cultural critic and social philosopher. Adorno was a cultural critic and musicologist. Horkheimer's ideal was a general understanding of the place of human beings in society. He thought, contrary to orthodox Marxists who often viewed society from the standpoint of the proletariat, that no social class at that time escaped distortions in its social worldview. Adorno thought that Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg's atonal music supported human autonomy or freedom, and he strongly condemned jazz as a form of music for the masses, in contrast. In a way, given their shared view that Marxism should not be culturally centered on the proletariat, it is not surprising that Horkheimer and Adorno collaborated, producing Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1974. They argued that the progress sought in the Enlightenment could not be achieved, and that instead the result would be either mass capitalistic vulgarity in a consumer economy, or totalitarian brutality.
What is Catherine MacKinnon's argument against pornography?
According to MacKinnon, pornography not only exploits and objectifies those women who are its subjects, but it also expresses and supports the overall oppression of women in society. The subordinate status of women in pornography. as well as the violence against women depicted in so many of its forms, is part of an unjust sex-gender system.
What are the modules of the mind, according to Jerry Fodor?
In his The Modularity of Mind, 1983, Fodor posits transducers, senses that connect us with the outside world. Input systems, and central systems. Input and central systems are distinguished by the fact that input systems are modular and central systems are not. Modules each have one kind of cognitive material, for example, the visual module. And their information is encapsulated so that they can work very quickly, although they are inaccessible to conscious introspection. One module can be destroyed without impairing the others, as in cases of aphasia. Besides the different sensory systems, language is a module. It should be noted that Fodor does not hesitate to compare his theory with the system of phrenology propounded by Franz Joseph Gall. 1758 to 1828, which is usually taken to be an example of early pseudoscience. The non-modular central systems correspond to thinking and believing and have access to other contents of the mind. Unlike language, the non-modular central system is not localized.
How did John Stuart Mill define the difference between higher and lower pleasures?
Mill did not think that a simple quantitative calculus could be used to make moral decisions. He argued that there were lower pleasures that were mainly connected with immediate physical gratification and delight, and higher pleasures that involved delayed gratification or prior diligence. The higher pleasures, such as those found in the cultivation and enjoyment of art, literature, poetry, and friendship, were better than the lower pleasures. Mill's proof that they were better was the testimony of those who had experienced both the lower and higher pleasures.
Who was Pierre-Simon Laplace?
Pierre-Simon Laplace, 1749 to 1827, was a mathematician and astronomer who explicated what was to be the classic theory of probability. He taught in Paris at different schools, such as the École Militaire, military school.
Who was Voltaire?
Voltaire was the pen name of François-Marie Arouet, 1694 to 1778. A playwright, poet, essayist, and widely read popularizer of Sir Isaac Newton. His Philosophical Letters, 1734, and Philosophical Dictionary, 1764. Both express his brilliant wit and underlying sense of social justice. He made great fun of Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, as Dr. Pangloss in the satire Candide, but although he thought that this was not the best of all possible worlds. As Pangloss did, he believed improvement was possible on specific issues. Voltaire's empiricism was similar to that of John Locke, 1632–1704. In that he was a moderate skeptic who also thought that human knowledge is generally adequate for the lives most people lead. In other words, we know what we need to know. He argued for toleration and objected to the narrowness of church Christianity. By the same token, he did not go as far as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. 1712–1778, in extolling simplicity over civilization. He replied to Rousseau after he gave him a copy of the Social Contract. I have received your new book against the human race, and thank you for it. Never was such a cleverness used in the design of making us all stupid. One longs, in reading your book, to walk on all fours. But as I have lost that habit for more than 60 years, I feel unhappily the impossibility of resuming it.
Why were ideas important to Berkeley?
An idea in this sense is a technical term, meaning some discrete thing in the mind. Berkeley's metaphysics began with the assumption that all we ever know are our ideas, which are in our minds. This is one reason why ideas are so important. We tend to assume that if we have a word for something then we have an idea of it. But sometimes we fool ourselves, and our words are just empty with no ideas behind them. Therefore, we need to make sure that we actually have the ideas we think we have. Just because we are accustomed to using language in certain ways, does not mean that all words that are intelligible to us refer to ideas. If we reflect on abstract, general words, such as man, whiteness, animal, or matter, it becomes evident that there is nothing in the mind to which these words refer. All of our ideas are about particulars or combinations of particulars. We lack the capacity to create new ideas. Only God can do that, although we are able to combine existing ideas in new ways and create copies of existing ideas.
Who was Moritz Schlick?
Moritz Schlick, 1882–1936, is famous for claiming that philosophy was dependent on science, intellectually. He was a philosopher who studied with the physicist Max Planck before arriving in Vienna, Austria, in 1922. His presence was the inspiration for the mathematician Hans Hahn to inaugurate the discussion group of the Vienna Circle, which, in addition to Hahn and Schlick, at first contained Otto Neurath, 1882–1945, and the physicist Philipp Frank. Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, joined them in 1926. Schlick was professor of the philosophy of inductive sciences at the University of Vienna, while he led the Vienna Circle. He believed that empirical knowledge was not about the content of experience, which could not be communicated, but about the form of experience. He maintained that all genuine philosophical problems and questions were either mathematical or logical, or could be solved by scientific investigation. Schlick believed that this implied that philosophy had no subject matter of its own that was distinct from the sciences. However, unlike other logical positivists, he thought that ethics were practical and that moral goodness was simply whatever is approved by society. Moral obligation could be studied as what is generally required by society. His main works include General Theory of Knowledge, 2nd edition, 1925, and Problems of Ethics, translated, 1939.
What were the new logic and four types of idols made famous by Francis Bacon's Novum Organum?
In his New Atlantis, 1627, Francis Bacon, 1561–1626. Described a social organization for scientific research. His Novum Organum, 1620, presented a new logic of induction, which would take the place of both Aristotelian logic and a simple collection of facts. The aim was to discover real natural laws or reliable generalizations about aspects of nature. Bacon's system became famous for the obstacles to acquiring such knowledge, which he described as four kinds of idols. First were idols of the tribe or natural tendencies of thought, such as a search for purposes in nature or reading human desires and needs onto natural things and events. The second were the idols of the cave or the idiosyncrasies and biases of individuals due to their education, social background, association, and the authorities they favored. The third type were idols of the marketplace or meanings of words taken for granted when the words themselves did not stand for anything that existed in reality. And, finally, the idols of the theater were the influence of theories that had already been widely accepted.
What is ethical naturalism?
Ethical naturalism holds that goodness is a natural property and that morality can be understood without intuitions, conscience, or religion.
Who was James Martineau?
James Martineau, 1805–1900, was an English religious intuitionist. His main works were Types of Ethical Theory, 1885, and A Study of Religion, 1888. His distinct contribution was to develop a specifically religious interpretation of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804, Metaphysics.
What is the they?
Martin Heidegger's term the they was meant to refer to ordinary people who go about their everyday lives with no philosophical awareness of their existence.
Who were the pre-Socratics?
The pre-Socratics, the term simply means those philosophers who came before Socrates. Came from outlying Greek city-states located on islands far from Athens, which was the cultural center of ancient Greece. Their ideas circulated widely among Greek intellectuals all over the civilized Western world. In chronological order, the main pre-Socratics were, Thales, c. 624–c. 546 BCE, Anaximander, c. 610–c. 546 BCE, Anaximenes of Miletus, 580–500 BCE, Pythagoras, c. 575–495 BCE, Heraclitus, 535–475 BCE, Anaxagoras, c. 500–428 BCE, Parmenides, N.D., Zeno of Elea, c. 490–430 BCE, Empedocles, c. 490–430 BCE, Leucippus, N.D., and Democritus, c. 460–c. 370 BCE. They were well-educated men who had enough leisure time to ponder deep questions.
What is philosophy of film?
Film criticism, both scholarly and popular, has a history as long as visual media. But philosophy of film, as a contemporary subfield in aesthetics, or philosophy of art, dates from the 1970s. As in other fields, the philosophy of film is similar to the theory of film undertaken by specialists in film or film studies. There are philosophers who, like film theorists and critics, specifically study film as a self-contained medium. Philosophical cultural critics who use film as evidence of broad beliefs in contemporary culture. And philosophers who turn to film for examples in ethics, aesthetics, political philosophy, feminism, and many other philosophical interests and subfields. As well, some films directly raise philosophical questions, such as the questions about what is real in The Matrix, 1999, and its sequels, and the nature of memory and identity raised by Memento, 2000, and the children's film The Never-Ending Story, 1984. There are, moreover, films that are directly about philosophy and philosophers such as The Easter, 2004, which is about Martin Heidegger, 1889–1976. Contemporary sources on philosophy and film include, Richard Allen and Murray Smith, editors. Film Theory and Philosophy, 1997, Gregory Curry, Image and Mind, Film, Philosophy and Cognitive Science. 1995, and Cynthia A. Freeland and Thomas E. Wartenberg, Philosophy and Film, 1995. The online journal Film Philosophy, a philosophical review of film studies and world cinema, is an ongoing source of contemporary work and additional sources.
Did John Stuart Mill have much chance to indulge in the pleasure principle as he grew up?
The pleasure principle was certainly not applied to Mill's young life in the same sense as Jeremy Bentham's. 1748 to 1832 formulation, although it possibly was in Mill's more nuanced version of utilitarianism, which distinguished between higher and lower pleasures. Mill's father, James, with help from his friend Bentham, educated the young Mill at home. Young John knew Greek at 3, Latin at 5, logic by 12, and economics by 16. He was also deeply schooled in a social mission to increase the good for the greatest number through progressive political programs. Mill had a nervous breakdown at 20. Biographers believe that his highly structured and rigorous childhood education was the cause of an emotional imbalance. The humanities had been neglected in his education, and his social interactions with peers were limited by the demands of his studies. Mill then began a course of study in literature to develop his more humanistic sensibilities. He read Romantic poetry and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he began to rethink Bentham's simple hedonic calculus. The result was Mill's famous distinction between higher and lower pleasures and a scathing assessment of Bentham's character as oblivious and uncultured. Bentham, an essay first published in the London and Westminster Review in 1838, and revised in 1859 for his own Dissertations and Discussion, Volume 1.
What are some of the current issues in Native American philosophy?
The concerns address politics, ecology, religion, and feminism. The Native American claims are both straightforward and difficult to solve. Political activist and former ethnic studies professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, Ward Churchill, has argued that progressive movements within mainstream American society do not address Native American ideals because those progressive movements are dedicated to getting more of the prizes of technology and capitalism. Traditional Native Americans, by contrast, seek to withdraw from the dominant system and into self-sufficient traditional communities. To some extent, the current political issues of Native Americans concern ecology and environmentalism. On the one hand, Native Americans may refuse to be used as symbols of ecological virtue, even though ideals of self-sufficiency on tribal lands do rely on sustainable ecological practices. It is a significant irony that some Native American communities have been able to use profits from their casinos to purchase those ancestral lands that the U.S. promised them in unfulfilled treaties. Viola Cordova, 1937 to 2002, a university professor and the first Native American to earn a doctorate in philosophy. She was also part Hispanic, argued that the history of Western philosophy has an overwhelming Christian bias and influence in ways that are incomprehensible to thinkers in native cultures. Ann Waters, another Native American philosopher, as well as an attorney who teaches at California State University at Bakersfield, has challenged the myth of European discovery of the Americas, referring to oral traditions claiming that Native Americans have always inhabited the Americas. Native American women writers such as Paula Gunn Allen have traced matriarchal patterns in indigenous political history, which were dislodged by European settlers who refused to negotiate with female leaders. This suggests very different feminist concerns among Native American women compared to Western feminists. Recovering political power instead of attaining it.
What general philosophical problems does environmentalism pose?
In more traditional philosophical terms, there are ontological and metaphysical issues involved in what counts as a unit in environmentalism. It is important to define the unit because that defines the subject matter theoretically, and makes it possible to keep track of what should be preserved, in practical terms.
What was social Darwinism?
Social Darwinism was an application of the Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest to inequalities and opportunities in contemporary 19th century society. It was an age in which the enterprising could amass large fortunes in a short period of time, although they had to compete with other capitalists. And those who labored, often in unhealthy and exhausting conditions for barely enough pay to support themselves, also competed among themselves for available jobs. Social Darwinists wrote popular books, sometimes consisting of what today would be considered racist or class-based eugenics. And their claims made a strong impression on general readers. They shared a belief that competition was valuable in itself and that those who failed in life's contests failed a deeper test of evolutionary survival. Instead of social reform, their ideals were to encourage the traits that enabled success at competition by means of selective human breeding, as well as moral approval of the winners.
What are some of Aristotle's works and what are they about?
Aristotle's Organon consists of 6 early works, categories, on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and sophistical refutations. These, together with the physics and the metaphysic, address logic, language, the nature of scientific inquiry, and what philosophers have since called ontology, which is the study of things that are real or things that exist. These works demonstrate a systematic philosophic method of analysis and provide the results of that method in general areas of human knowledge. More specific scientific accounts are found in Aristotle's On Generation and Corruption, On the Heavens, and Meteorology. On the Soul deals with the general functions of the mind, which in Aristotle's Parva Naturalis are applied to specific functions, such as remembering, dreaming, sleeping, and waking. Aristotle's works on biology include the history of animals, parts of animals, and on the generation of animals. The Nicomachean Ethics and Eudemian Ethics constitute Aristotle's theory of moral virtue, whereas his political philosophy is put forth in the Politics. The Rhetoric discusses oratory and persuasion, and the Poetics contains his theory of tragedy as an art form.
What is known about Immanuel Kant's life?
Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg in East Prussia. His father was a saddler, and his grandfather was a Scottish immigrant. After attending the local high school, he was taught by the philosopher Marin Knudsen at the University of Königsberg. He worked as a tutor and returned to take a master's degree, after which he was employed as a Privatdozent, private docent, or PD, to teach physics, mathematics, anthropology, geography, and some philosophy. In his courses on anthropology and geology, he taught the prevailing view of European racial supremacy over Asians and Africans. He was poor until 1770, when he secured the position of Chair of Logic and Metaphysics at Königsberg. Other European intellectuals, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, whom Kant greatly admired, constantly moved and traveled to secure their fame and livings, with amorous and political adventure. As a kind of byproduct of their intellectual careers. But that was not for Kant. He never left the area of East Prussia, and remained a bachelor in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, all his life. When the Prussian king asked him not to publish further about religion in 1794, he duly complied. Kant's health was fragile, but he took care of himself, living until he was 80. He relied on travelers and published works for information about the outside world and was content to dine with friends and fulfill his professorial duties, including a term as rector of the university. Kant's early works were about natural science, the most notable being his General History of Nature and Theory of the Heavens, 1755. His magnum opus was the Critique of Pure Reason. But when it finally appeared in 1781, few could understand it. He tried to make his ideas more accessible in his Prolegomena to Every Future Metaphysics, 1783. This was followed by his 1790 Critique of Practical Reason and the Critique of Judgment. In 1793 and 1797, he published Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason and the Metaphysic of Morals. Kant was by then famous, but younger thinkers undertook to explain his system better than he had. He was working on his response to them in his opus posthumum when he died.
What is feminism and feminist philosophy?
Feminism involves both thought and practice aimed at improving the well-being of women. On the side of practice, it is often thought of as the women's movement. Intellectually, feminism is a critical theory because it contains analysis of social conditions and prescriptions for improving them toward its end. Also, on the intellectual side, feminism is now a multidisciplinary academic field with participation from all of the humanities, contemporary cultural criticism, the social sciences, and women's studies. Feminist philosophy is the philosophical dimension of intellectual feminism. Many feminist philosophers understand their intellectual history and the history of the women's movement in terms of three waves.
What are the major works of Thomas Aquinas?
Aquinas, 1224–1274, wrote prodigiously throughout his life, and his works include commentaries on the writings of Aristotle, reports on Albertus Magnus. 1200–1280, lectures, a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, c. 1095–1160, and other philosophical treatises such as On Being and Essence and On the Principles of Nature, as well as on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists. He is most famous for his Summa against the Gentiles and Summa on Theology.
How is environmentalism related to racial and international studies?
Theorists of racial discrimination such as Laura Westra and Bill E. Lawson have identified environmental racisms. Minorities, who live in poor neighborhoods, are more vulnerable to having toxic dump sites in their immediate environments, for example. Some indigenous philosophers have criticized the whole Western technological project. By contrast, international scholars have criticized Western environmentalists for assuming that development in poor countries for the improvement of human life is less important than the preservation of nature.
What was Sigmund Freud's Oedipal theory?
The Oedipal theory, or Freud's idea of the Oedipus complex, was based on Freud's instinct theory that there are enduring sexual desires in the human psyche, as well as opposition to their expression. Sexuality and its opposition take the form of libido versus ego, or self-preservation in early and middle life, and the form of eros, or desiring life, versus thanatos, or a wish to die, toward the end. It's interesting that Freud thought the wish to die was a human expression of a longing in all life to return to an inorganic state. The Oedipus complex results from a situation in which the child desires the mother as a result of prolonged human dependency on one caregiver. Male children fear that their fathers will punish them through castration. Female children transfer their original Oedipal yearnings for their mothers to their fathers in an Electra complex, which is also accompanied by penis envy. This all occurs unconsciously in terms of active and passive principles that later come to be expressed and identified as male and female, respectively. Because the primary process of the psyche tends toward a cathartic discharge of repressed energy. The pleasure principle is Freud's main explanatory tool. He applied this principle to the way in which the emergence of unconscious material can account for humor and also everyday failures in function and memory. In psychoanalysis, both dreams and free association could be used to access unconscious conflicts and particularly Oedipal fantasies.
How did Copernicus change the Ptolemaic system?
The system introduced by Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, was that Earth and all of the planets revolved around the Sun in concentric circles. Copernicus was further able to reduce the number of postulated epicecles to 34, still saving the appearances, or not contradicting what was observed. This shifted the fundamental frame of astronomical reference from Earth to the fixed stars. As he wrote, first and above all lies the sphere of the fixed stars, containing itself and all things, for that reason immovable, in truth the frame of the universe, to which the motion and position of all other stars are referred. Though some men think it to move in some way, we assign another reason why it appears to do so in our theory of the movement of the Earth. Of the moving bodies first comes Saturn, who completes his circuit in XXX years. After him, Jupiter, moving in a 12-year revolution. Then Mars, who revolves biennially. Fourth in order an annual cycle takes place, in which we have said is continued the Earth, with the lunar orbit as an epicycle. In the fifth place Venus is carried round in 9 months. Then Mercury holds the sixth place, circulating in the space of 80 days. Copernicus' conclusions were based mainly on mathematics, drawing on the perennial value of simplicity and the doctrine that nature always behaves in the most commodious, simple, way. To the objection that objects would fly off a moving Earth, he responded that a moving sky, because it was larger, would move even faster and do more damage.
How did James Martineau make Immanuel Kant's metaphysics religious?
Martineau relied on intuition to claim that the phenomenal world mirrors a noumenal world, the world of things we cannot experience, in which real objects are causally related. He held that this reality is the result of God's will. In ethics he claimed that we choose our motives first and then our actions. Intuition tells us which ones are the higher motives and that the highest one is reverence. He meant that the desire to revere motivates our best actions.
What are some results of experimental philosophy?
Thus far, Bertrand Russell's 1872–1970 theory of descriptions has failed. At least one intuitive test. Respondents are inclined to blame people for what they do unintentionally, which, according to philosophers, they should not. Free will is also held to be compatible with determinism, which philosophers have assumed not to be the case.